Why don't we get started? It's just about 10 after. Tonight, I am going to discuss power and influence. And next week is the due date for your discussion board on The Fog of War. Okay, a great documentary. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, maybe about 20 years ago. McNamara died a few years later. But I think given what's going on in the world right now, it's very current. And you can learn a lot, not just about negotiation, which the whole movie is really about negotiating. And you see how the principles of negotiation apply to, whatever level you're on, including the very top level. But also things like power and influence. McNamara was a master at power and influence. That's how he got where he got, which was he was the president. He was promoted to the presidency of the Ford Motor Company and then hired a few weeks later to be the Secretary of Defense. And then when that didn't work out after, I think it was 8 years or so, he was appointed to be the president of the World Bank for 13 years. He had started out early in life as a professor, so he kind of transformed himself in many ways. Somebody once told a story about him that it was in the book The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam, which I highly recommend. It's about the Kennedy administration, including there's two classic chapters about McNamara, which when I took OB in 1979, when I took this class, more or less, the professor assigned those two chapters about, this was long before The Fog of War had come out. It was truly, it's a great book. Then maybe about 10 years ago, I read the full book, and it's well worth the read. It's definitely a classic. And he put McNamara right in the middle of the book, chapters 12 and 13, and he says in there that one of his lower ranking aides in the Department of Defense had been offered the position of White House press secretary, which is a highly visible job. I mean, if you watch TV news at all, you sooner or later will come across the White House press secretary. They're on the TV all the time. And the person went to McNamara and said to him, should I take the job of White House press secretary? And McNamara said to him, no, don't take it, turn it down. And then he said, if you're going to take a job in the White House, you should think about which jobs have the most power, the subject for tonight. And he then proceeded to analyze every single job in the White House. He didn't work in the White House. He was the Secretary of Defense, but he went through every job in the White House that was, of interest to this guy. And he analyzed how much power the job had relative to the White House press secretary. And he showed him that the White House press secretary was like a joke job compared to a lot of other things that might not be as visible. So basically, he had thought that carefully about the power relationships in the White House. He had to deal with the White House all the time. So he was closely connected. And so he wanted to know who he had to care about and who he didn't have to care about. But beyond that, when you watch the movie, one of the telling things about his narrative is when he talks about the Kennedys, and he was so close to the family that he picked out JFK's grave. So, in other words, in a very short amount of time, from not even knowing the Kennedys, when Kennedy was first elected in 1960, within a few years, he was so close to the family that they viewed him as a family member. And that's the kind of person that will tend to gain a lot of power. In other words, you develop long-term relationships with powerful people that facilitate your own obtaining power. There's a similar story, incidentally, concerning Robert Moses, whom I go into in depth in my 3200 class. Some of you have had that class. And Moses gained power. Robert Moses was the guy that built all the beaches and highways, and built most of the bridges in the city, especially the ones built after 1940 or so. So he built like the Triborough Bridge, the Verrazano Bridge, the Queens Midtown Tunnel, the Whitestone Bridge. The first one was the Henry Hudson Parkway Bridge, and he built a lot more than that. So he built so many things you can't even get your mind. He built pretty much all the highways in the New York City area. So if you're ever on a highway, he probably built it, like, whether it's the FDR, the Van Wyck, or the Interborough, what used to be the Interborough, now the Jackie Robinson, and on, just no limit, really. And he had the classic book about him, The Power Broker, by Robert Caro. What he describes in there is that Moses had networked for like 10 years after he finished his PhD at Columbia. He had gone to Yale, Oxford, and then Columbia, and he didn't have a job for like 12 years. And he basically networked the whole time. Not that he didn't have a really good network in the first place, because he knew a lot of the elite people from Yale and so on, but he networked for like 10, 15 years. And he knew the owner of the New York Times, Iphigene Sulzberger, really well. And he finally got his first job because he was introduced to the governor of New York, Al Smith. If you haven't heard that name, I suggest you read up on the history of New York, because Al Smith was probably the most influential governor in the history of New York, and among the most in the history of America. He had tremendous influence on the 20th century. And he was a very simple guy from a very blue-collar background, yet Moses, who was from the elite, befriended him. They became the best of friends. They socialized every single week, at least a couple of times. And through that, he got his first job, which was he was the head of the Department of State of New York. So basically what I'm saying is that this kind of intensive networking is how people gain power. It's one big way. Of course, it's not the only way. Of course, there's lots of other ways. It's just, my wife comes from Mongolia originally, and we were just talking about Genghis Khan, the national hero of Mongolia. Genghis Khan, you might think of him as a villain. He's often portrayed as such, and maybe he was in many ways, but he came from an impoverished background, and he led armies that conquered most of the known world at that time. And how he did that, was how he got that kind of power, was through brilliance, through ability, through understanding people, through motivating, through training, through a high degree of selflessness, where he shared the spoils with the entire army. And was able to train them. Also, he was a military genius. That's going to be true of anyone whose name endures for that long, that there's something truly unique about them. But the same was true of Robert Moses, incidentally. He was a genius in many ways. He designed the parks. You go to Jones Beach, it was his design. You'd say it was this really incredible place. Like this came out of his imagination. So it wasn't just the political skills, so expertise does play a big role in achieving that level of power. But I would say it's also, in most places, you don't need that level of expertise unless you're creating something from scratch, like you're a Steve Jobs type person or a Bill Gates type person. You don't need that huge level of expertise along with the political skills. You just need the political skills. So you can go really, really far just on the political skills. Of course, those aren't the people you've heard of, because, if you've heard of somebody, it's because they've done something amazing. And that requires a great deal of ability. And so the ones you've heard of are the ones who have both the ability and the political skills, people like Napoleon. I once heard I forget where I heard this, in a movie or something. Somebody quoted Napoleon. I don't know if it's true or not. They said he had said that there are very few people who are small enough to get power and big enough to use power well. And I think that's a really brilliant statement, whether Napoleon said it or not. He could well have, because that you have to really understand power to say something like that. So basically, to get power, you have to be really petty and manipulative. But to use power well, you have to be really big. You have to be like the great founder of Athenian society was Cleisthenes in I guess it was the 5th century BC. And he was really the one that made Athens the foundation of Western culture, because what he did was he completely leveled the society. He did away. There were a lot of people who had been enslaved because of debts, and there were all kinds of clans controlled different parts of Athenian, Athenian politics, and he completely obliterated. He redesigned the political system. He set different districts into one political unit so that people who didn't know each other had a vote in the same election. He ended the slavery for indebtedness. He abolished a lot of the indebtedness and basically totally equalized the society. And this opened up an explosion in innovation. And the amazing thing was, when I read the biography of Genghis Khan, he did the exact same thing. He totally equalized. He abolished a lot of the clans. He did away with hierarchy. He gave people equal shares. He did a lot of the same things that Cleisthenes did. So in other words, these really amazing leaders have the vision to do away with special privilege and make society more equal. And, of course, there's no one like that today in America. So basically, there's only been a few of those in world history. So basically, though, power in corporate America is a little less dramatic, although it can be. I mean, if you look at the really great executives, people like Tom Watson at IBM, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, people like that, they are of that ilk also. They often have not just immense talent, but also great understanding of politics and power. So basically, the definition of power is that it's the capacity and discretion to enforce one's will over others. Part of it is dependence. If people are dependent on somebody, the person becomes more powerful. Leadership, as we were talking about last week, implies more interdependence. So leaders get their followers to do what they want through persuasion, and part of power involves persuasion, but it doesn't have to. The book suggests that power is generally downward. I don't totally agree with that. I think in today's world, it's far more useful and important to develop long-term relationships with people, and it's through those relationships that people get power. So I think the more important part of power is understanding upward relationships. If you can develop relationships with people higher than you, that's where you get the power. That's what Robert Moses did, for example. So formal power might be called positional power, and it depends on someone's position in the organization. So somebody who's in a central or a high level job will tend to have more power. And that's closely related to legitimate power, which is based on someone's position. Personal power, on the other hand, comes from the individual. And it can include expertise and the respect or admiration of others. Now, one way I would look at this is that there are certain personal traits that tend to get you power. And these include whether people tend to like you, whether, I would include like respect you, whether people are, and not only that, but whether people trust you, I would say. And then also, there's also in that whether you put out the necessary effort, whether you have the expertise needed that I was just talking about, and whether you have something that's called legitimacy. And the idea of legitimacy is that you appeal to the norms that people share with you. So you somehow reflect their value system. So in general, if you work in a law firm, it's unlikely that the head of the law firm will ever be anything other than a lawyer. If you work in a firm that does a lot of stock trading, it's unlikely that the head of the firm will ever be anything other than a stock trader. Okay, so legitimacy means that you appeal to the norms. It's not just in things like that are directly related to the business. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. So, for example, if you look at what people care about, let's say you work in a company and everybody in the company is a jock. You know, that's a term that in my day, I don't know if it still is, refers to someone who's very athletic. And basically, if you have a company where people are really into sports, and they don't just watch sports, but they actually they play basketball or whatever, tennis, whatever. So whatever sport they play, it might be something like golf in most companies, but it could be in some companies, other kinds of things. So if you're really good at those sports, you've got an inside edge to being dominant in that company. Right. So like if it's a company that really cares about tennis and they hire you and you're a nationally ranked tennis player, you're going to have an inside track there because everyone is going to look up to you automatically. So you're going to be influential. And if that sounds irrational and irrelevant, it probably is, but it's true in virtually all companies. It may not be something like sports. It could be, for example, do you live in the same town that the top people live in? So when executives get hired, they may choose to move to the town that where a lot of the executives live. I've seen this firsthand. Or it could be that sometimes it's religion. It could be religion, like you adopt the religion. It could be a lot of things. So basically, fitting in these petty ways is often central to having legitimacy, and so being able to gain power. Okay, referent power is based on identification with somebody who controls resources. So basically, if if you're Robert Moses, identifying with Al Smith is going to get you power. Resources play a big role in determining which groups of people get power. So if you control resources yourself, you're going to have power. So like if you're somebody who has the ability to come up with military strategies that win wars, you will gain power. But let's say you work in a university. This was studied by Jeff Pfeffer and Solanchik, who did a lot of work on power, and they studied universities. And what they found was that, first of all, the departments that tended to gain the most power in a university tended to be the ones who could secure the resources the university needed for survival. So, for example, if you were a department that attracted a lot of students, you would gain power. If you were a department that could secure research grants, you would gain a lot of power. All right. So having access or control of the resources that the institution needs would tend to gain you power. Now, what would happen over time is that power is institutionalized. And let's say it changes, like students at one point all want to be education majors, and then they later start gravitating toward business majors. I'm just making this up, but it has no basis in reality. But let's say that occurs. When the education students were numerous, the education department in the school tended to gain resources and power. Then when the students start gravitating toward business, the education department doesn't want to give up those resources and power. And so what Pfeffer and Solanchik said is that the viability of an organization depends on its ability to redefine who has power, so that the older group is willing to give up power to the newer group. So if the control of resources changes, the group that once had control of resources is willing to give up power to the new group, then the organization will continue to grow. If that is not in the cards, then the organization will stagnate and die. Okay, so basically, I've so far been talking about some broad parameters. Another one is personality traits. People with the dark triad traits, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism, tend to gain power. So one of the great tragedies of the human race is the tendency of people to put their faith in psychopaths and narcissists and Machiavellians, people with the dark triad traits. And you see this over and over again in history, that that democracy leads to this. In fact, Aristotle talked about it 2,500 years ago. He said that democracy is a corruption of polity. What polity means is open to discussion, but basically, I think the closest thing in history was the US government, which, especially in the 19th century, when it had a decentralized form and relatively strict restrictions on government power, I would say it was close to being a polity, but it, it devolves into a democracy, and basically we're seeing what Aristotle predicted. That money is spent to favor special interest groups, large amounts of welfare spending, subsidies to people who are politically connected, and so on. So basically, one of the big things, now this gets a little practical, one of the big things in power is how do you turn power into influence? And that's where the issue really becomes one of personal success. So basically, if you think of like a lot of the presidents, they all had the same power more or less, but some were very good at managing it and some were very bad at managing it. So how do you turn power into influence? If you look at two presidents, both Democrats, Carter and Johnson, Carter was inept. He was a nice guy. I voted for him actually in '76, but did I? I think I did. But he was inept. He couldn't figure out how to end inflation. There was a Iran hostage crisis. He didn't get anything done. And then finally, when he figured out how to end inflation, which Milton Friedman could have told him in the first place, he did it right when he was up for re-election. And it's obvious to anyone that if you raise interest rates a year before the election, you're going to create a recession. He didn't really think this through, and he ended up losing to Reagan. In contrast, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, I did not like him when he was president, but he was able to get a lot done. It ended up being a disaster because what he got done wasn't always the right thing. I mean, I think he was an idiot, but I think you'll see that when you watch The Fog of War. McNamara does a hatchet job on him. He, basically blames him for the Vietnam War, which I think is true. I mean, who else should be responsible but Johnson? But basically, he was able to get things done. He was able to get his way. And he did some really great things. And the Vietnam War was a disaster. One of the great things, he's able to get the Civil Rights Act passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the reason was he understood Congress. He had been the Speaker of the House. And he was able to push through probably the most important single federal law of the 20th century, was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then, of course, in Vietnam, Kennedy, I don't think McNamara tells you this in the movie, but Kennedy had signed or was about to sign an executive order withdrawing the troops from Vietnam. And he was also close to signing an executive order that would have reestablished the gold standard. And I heard this from his nephew, RFK Jr., whom I've met. And basically, both executive orders were proposed in October of 1963, and Kennedy was assassinated in November of that year, a month later. So basically, when Johnson was elected, I think it was the 22nd. I was in fourth grade. Yeah, the 22nd. So basically, when Johnson got into office after Kennedy's assassination, he completely reversed this idea of pulling us out of Vietnam and escalated the war, and it was a complete disaster. And so, I mean, Johnson was very good at using influence, and he was a great politician, better than Kennedy in the sense of being able to use power, but he was an idiot. So, you know, I take your pick. So anyway, personality traits contribute to power. And oh yeah, so I was talking about influence tactics. So basically, you could say that there are three chief influence tactics. One would be like appeal, personal appeal. So you could appeal to somebody based on rationally explain to them why you should have power. Robert Moses was very good at that. And that part of why he got power was he was able to justify that he was building all this stuff, and the government of New York City had been corrupt for a century and a half. And he was able to build like dozens of things and get them done. And no one else had been able to do that. So, I mean, there was a rational basis for his getting to power. There's also like inspirational appeal. So if you can appeal to people emotionally and let them give you power, then you're going to get power. Also, if you can appeal on the basis of legitimacy, it's not just the authority and position, but it's also, do you appeal to people on the basis that you're addressing issues that are of legitimate concern to society, and you're able to get things done, that you're the one who's doing the right things. The second approach to gaining power, so the first one is like personal appeal, rationality, emotion, legitimacy, consultation, also involving understanding what the people want, what the people who work for you want, and then giving it to them. The second one is exchange or reciprocity. So basically, this means that if people give you power, you give them something in return. So basically, it could be that you flatter them. You know, if you look at Hitler, one of his tactics was to tell the Germans that they were the master race. So this is a way of flattery. It appeals to people's narcissism, among other things. So basically, there were a lot of, I'm not saying the whole country, I think at any point most Germans favored Hitler, but he appealed to enough of them to have a power base. And, you know, I think the ones who are frustrated, who are, you know, poor, are going to find this kind of racism appealing. There's so far I've talked about reason and reciprocity. And the third one is that you can try to use pressure on people, threats, retribution. You can also use things like pressure from a coalition. So you have a group of voters that presses the political structure to do something. Okay, so the three broad things: reason, reciprocity, and retribution. To be good at using power. So in other words, these are not how you get power. These are ways to
Why are
use.
you so scared? You don't need to be afraid. I promise you, nobody's gonna hurt you. Whoa.
Joyce, your mic is on.
Okay, no problem. So basically, all right. Now, one thing that's really interesting is the susceptibility to people to influence tactics. If you read the book, The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, she talks about the rise of both Stalin and Hitler. She wrote it in the early 1950s, and a more recent book by a guy named Desmet is about the psychology of totalitarianism. And basically, I think part of the reason that democracies are susceptible to totalitarianism is that most people do not participate logically in the electoral process, that they superficially consider their political choices based on information they get from a media that's often controlled by the political system itself. So most people base their beliefs on propaganda, in other words. And so basically, this idea of automatic processing is that people superficially consider evidence and information that takes little time. And so they're often going to be motivated by things that aren't really true. If you've ever seen the movie Idiocracy, it's a hilarious movie, at least the first half. The second half got a little nutty, but by Mike Judge, the Beavis and Butthead guy. And basically Idiocracy is about a civilization in the future where everyone's dumb, but they inherited all this technology. So they inherited technology, so they live like a good life, but none of them understand the technology or are able to really cope with it. And at some point, the leader, the head of the agricultural, the head of what was it again? Gatorade. Convinced them that they should use Gatorade to water the plants, and everything's dying. Well, their agriculture is dying, and they can't figure out that you shouldn't use Gatorade to water like crops. And basically, this is the kind of thing that when you talk about automatic processing, that they'd say, oh, well, yeah, no, Gatorade should work with crops because there's electrolytes. Like, it has no meaning. It's like, it's a meaningless explanation. Like, what are electrolytes? No one quite knows. But basically, people believe these kinds of explanations. Okay, if you look at the advertisements, they're often, they've got some spurious rationale for why you should buy a product. And this is the same in politics. Political propaganda is not very different from advertising of any kind. So basically, leaders can often use this principle that subtle motivational cues can influence employee performance and motivation. In controlled processing, there are careful thought processes, and there's relatively little of that in society. Okay, so some people have a strong need for cognition, which predicts the tendency to engage in controlled processing. Such people are going to become scholars or maybe lawyers, or certain things where there's a need for careful analysis. I mean, economists or whatever. But in general, very, very few people have control of their mental processes and are very easily influenced by casual suggestion. I mean, another example of that is the stock market, where virtually everyone who does not really focus on it makes casual decisions based on stock market tips, bubbles, emotional impulses and the like, and as a result often gets hurt. Okay, who is political? Extroverts tend to use political skills more than introverts. People who are risk tolerant and have the trait of Machiavellianism, obviously it's almost tautological, are more likely to use politics. Okay, and also, if you are political, you will tend to have more self-efficacy, you will be more satisfied, and you will experience less stress. Now, there's a famous saying by Lord Acton. Lord Acton was a political philosopher in Britain in the 19th century. And he said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay, so Robert Moses is a great example. If you ever read The Power Broker, you know, Cairo says there's a history of New York. Rick Burns' New York, a documentary history. If you watch through that, like one of the episodes, I think it's episode 6 or 5, is almost half of it is about Robert Moses. And, you know, Cairo says in there, and he makes it clear in the book as well, that Moses starts out very idealistic, that he wants to create the public beaches and he wants to build highways, and he was good at getting power, and he would get the power to use it for these socially desirable ends, and he was very successful at it. But over time, the projects that he built more and more reflected the need for power. So in other words, it started out that he wanted power to build good projects, and at the end, he wanted projects to get more power for himself. Okay, so this is sort of what Lord Acton is saying, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So basically, people who have a strong need for power have a tendency to react to threats with behavior that legitimates their status. And they're more likely to have dark triad personality traits. Why do people engage in political behavior? First of all, personal factors. Second of all, people who are sensitive to social cues, people who are social conformists, people who are good at office politics, and people with internal locus of control are all going to be people who are more political. The more a person expects to increase future benefits from the organization, the less they're likely to use illegitimate forms of power. So in other words, successful executives will tend to use institutional power. This was recognized by the psychologist David McClelland, that great executives are highly focused on power, but they will tend to use legitimate forms of power. People don't always like office politics. Not everybody thinks it's worthwhile or legitimate, and basically some people see it as manipulative, destructive. Some people see it as a necessary evil. Some people think of it as useful, and some people just think it's part of organizational life and more or less a necessary evil. So basically, you can assess yourself to what degree do you like to use power. But I would say if your goal is to be a high-ranking executive in a corporation, you will need to be good at politics and power. And that I would say that's going to be true. Now, one aspect of power is using defensive tactics to avoid blame or to avoid attacks from political enemies. Some examples of defensive behaviors in your book are conforming, sometimes over-conforming, buck passing, blaming others, playing dumb, not pretending you don't understand what the issue is, stretching the time a task takes, stalling when you're asked to do something that you think might be politically difficult. Avoiding blame often involves covering CYA, covering your ASS, playing it safe, justifying your actions, scapegoating others, blaming others, misrepresenting information. This goes on all the time in the corporate world. It's a big part of the corporate world. Related to this is the idea of impression management. I've talked about this before. Irving Guffman wrote that great book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Impression management is the process by which individuals attempt to control the impressions that others have of them. We all do it. Okay, sometimes something happens, there's some crazy event, and it greatly influences public perceptions, other people's perceptions of us. We're caught in an embarrassing situation. Somebody finds out something about us and publicizes it, etc. So this can easily happen. So you have to be really careful, and that's why this idea of defensive behaviors, avoiding blame, avoiding action, these things are often very important. Impression management can build good relationships if it's perceived as authentic. If it's perceived as manipulative, then it can lead to negative feelings. So ways that people try to influence others' impressions of them, again, conformity to group norms or to other people's expectations, doing favors for people, coming up with excuses, coming up with apologies, self-promotion, enhancement, flattery, exemplification. Everybody uses impression management in business. So basically, if you look at power on the personal level, like to what degree do you want to use power? Do you want to take advantage of, opportunities? I would say that you need to build long-term relationships with powerful people. That is one of the chief ways. Now, of course, there's also, I gave as some examples, people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. There's also the issue of expertise. If you have extraordinary expertise, you have special expertise, that can be a source of power. And the most powerful people in business, whom we remember to this day, often it's because of their expertise. Okay, so as well, you won't be remembered for this, but all people who attain high degrees of success put out effort, and they need to have a strong desire for the success. They need to connect with the universe through their desire and really push to gain the ends that they're targeting. Now, of course, this can be power. It doesn't have to be. The great psychologist I mentioned a minute ago, David McClellan, said that there's 4 key motives in business. Need for achievement, which he thought was for society the most important one. He wrote a book, The Achieving Society, about how the most successful societies have the people with the most need for achievement. And the second one is need for power. And he said, although entrepreneurs and self-employed business people are motivated by the need for achievement, in the corporate world, if you work in a business setting in corporate America, then to get ahead, you need to have the need for power. Power moves you in the hierarchy. Achievement is where you establish. One is establishment of your own business. The other is accomplishment within a hierarchy. And so basically the need for legitimate power, power that furthers the ends of the organization, is ethical and so on, is characteristic of long-term corporate executives who move up the hierarchy. So the third motive that McClellan thought was important is need for affiliation, how much you like to deal with people. And the fourth was need for autonomy, the need for people to have control over their futures. But the two that distinguish successful entrepreneurs and executives, for entrepreneurs, it's need for achievement, for executives, need for power. So they're two different things. Now, I talked a little bit about Pfeffer and Solanchik, and I said that within a corporation, the units that can acquire the resources the company needs are the ones that get the power. And the company needs to be flexible enough so that it can change when the source of power, when the resources necessary for long-term flourishing change. So, for example, if the big problem for General Motors in the 1950s was getting finance, at that point in time, the finance executives should have had the most power. However, if it changes and they compete with the Japanese and they have to come up with better product quality, and that became their chief problem in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, then without a doubt, the power should shift to operations and production. If then the question becomes product innovation and new kinds of cars, such as, I'm just making this, I don't know if that's really their problem now. It could well be that the EV craze is overrated and we're not going to go in that direction. And I've read that Toyota is working on hydrogen powered cars, which is a whole new idea and no one knows what's going to come of it. And so this is all up in the air, but like what Elon Musk did was he put a lot of weight on innovation and that was very successful. But of course, he still sells far fewer cars than GM does. So basically, I'm just looking this up right now, number of cars sold, GM versus Tesla. So, okay, so basically the company with the most sales, the most car sales in the first half of oh, is this right? It says Tesla's no, not electric vehicles. I want total vehicles. Everything's always so confusing. All right, this is very hard. It's all about here. Auto companies ranked by sales, by numbers of cars sold. Okay, so if you look for that, I'm still not finding it. They only want to talk about EV sales. This is like one of these things from Google. They don't want to tell you the facts. They want to propagandize. So I don't know. Well, I'll look it up. I'll send you in an email. So basically, my point is just that the auto industry's required resources has changed over time. And so which department needs to be the most powerful is going to change over time. In the 1950s, it was finance and maybe labor relations. In the 1980s and 90s, it was product quality. Now it's product innovation. So each time it changes, the department that's important for that should be given more resources and so gain more power. And so they not given more, but should have control more, so because they can get more resources. And the same thing is true in society at large. I think societies need to be flexible because ideas that worked really well in the past are not likely to work really well in the future. And so basically, like, for example, just as an example, the source of most value in the economy, if you look at the stock market in the 1960s, was manufacturing. And so these giant industrial companies such as General Motors and the oil companies were dominating the S&P 500. They dominated the Fortune 500. Over time, tech became very important. The tech companies convinced everyone to use this kind of technology for better or worse. Sometimes I seriously doubt that it's for better. But in any case, everybody relies now on a few big tech monopolies. And these include Google, Microsoft, increasingly NVIDIA because of the artificial intelligence chips. They make the chips using artificial intelligence. Whether that pans out or not, I don't know. I'm not, I don't know what's going to happen there. And Apple, of course, and a few others. And so basically, these huge tech companies now dominate the economy. Now, of course, nobody could have predicted 30 years ago that today manufacturing would be relatively small and tech would be relatively large. But does that mean that will always be true? Of course not. So it could be in the future some other thing takes off. Who knows? I'm not a futurist. I couldn't tell you what it is, but it could be anything. It could be DNA research or biotech or some new industry we haven't even thought of yet. But whatever it is. So in other words, for a society to be successful, it has to allow these new ideas to percolate. And the sad truth is, I hate to break it to you, but it's true. And when I say I hate to, it's one instance where I really do hate to, because I wish it weren't true, is that very, very few countries in the world are open to new ideas. And so the ones that are the ones where innovation will displace political power. But to the extent that people give more and more power to the political system, innovation will be suppressed. And that's the way of the world. So basically, I'm just applying Pfeffer and Solanchik to society at large. And this idea is also discussed a great deal in what's called the public choice literature. The public choice literature I'm putting this because you probably never heard of it. The public choice literature discusses why is it that some economic interests and some corporations tend to gain power over the public. Like, why is it that the healthcare lobby will shape healthcare legislation, even though the public prefers a different kind of legislation? So there was a book in the 1990s by William Greider, who was a writer for Rolling Stone magazine. He wrote the book Who Will Tell the People? A little out of date now, but the message is more current than ever, right? I mean, he wrote it 30 years ago, but it's still relevant. If not only is it relevant, but it's more relevant than ever. And the idea is that certain special interest groups will tend to get power and the general voter will not. And the reason for that was identified by James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock in a classic book that's dense densely written called The Calculus of Consent. And basically, this idea was also set forth by a University of Chicago economist named, what was his first name? Stigler. George Stigler, forgot that. George Stigler, who wrote an article in the Journal of Law and Economics, which is published out of Chicago, called the economic theory of I always get it backward. The theory of economic regulation. And a close related idea and very straightforward writing, excellent writing. He had written a more technical book, but this was like written at the layman's level. It's a little bit more difficult than Grider's book. Grider's book is a popular book, it's a trade book, and it's readily understood. Mansur Olson's book, The Rise and Decline of Nations, and they're all of these are roughly making the same point, which is that in a capitalistic free economy, the institution of democracy will create a kind of auction system where interest groups that are able to accrue power are able to get their laws passed, and interest groups that aren't able to accrue power won't get their laws passed. So the question is who wins and who loses. And the basic idea is that if you have a small group with enormous economic gains from regulation. So, for example, Wall Street, there's, let's say 100 or 200 Wall Street firms or 300, whatever it is, I don't have many, but a few hundred Wall Street firms. I'm not just talking about the investment banks, different hedge funds and all that. Or commercial banks, there's thousands of commercial banks, but there's a few really big ones. And they can easily get together and push for legislation. Or you're talking about the pharmaceutical industry. So there's just so many pharmaceutical firms of size, and they can easily call each other and say what they want, what they should push for, and so on. So if you have, a small number of firms with enormous economic benefits, then they will have enormous financial incentives to push for legislation and can spend a great deal to get that legislation passed. And in contrast, let's say you've got an interest that is not concentrated anywhere. You've got, everybody has an interest in stable prices. Okay, but very few people understand what causes price stability. And very few people understand how to organize a pressure group that would create price stability. And very few people have the resources to organize anybody to press for price stability. Okay, on the other hand, Wall Street is easily organized because there are a few firms and they have an interest in more price instability. So it's not that they care about price instability, they don't want that, but what they want is low interest rates, which causes price instability. So basically, it's like saying, do you favor a bigger house or a house that uses more wood? Clearly, if you want a bigger house, you favor using less wood, but in order to have a bigger house, you have to use more wood. So, Wall Street, it's not that they favor price instability, they don't. but they favor lower interest rates. So you can't have lower interest rates without price instability. So, it's that. So basically, there's a lot more pressure for lower interest rates than there is for price instability, than for price stability. Now, of course, when people start to experience extreme instability, such as we experienced in the last couple of years, what's going to happen is they start getting upset. If people go hungry, then they become violent. They're not going to function in a way that's politically desirable for anybody, including themselves. So they're going to become violent. There'll be riots. They're going hungry and so on. So basically, there's limits, but within those limits, if they don't go too far, there's not going to be a reaction. And if they keep the greed within a certain restraint, so that if people's lives are threatened in some way, then there's going to be fighting. There's going to be instability. So they don't want that. So they put a stop to it. All right. When, what COVID did was I'm not sure what the motive for what they did in COVID. I don't really believe it was to stop COVID because, this is just my opinion, because it did nothing to stop COVID, the lockdowns and all the wretched nonsense things. But basically, if you push things far enough, you print a lot of money and you give it out, and you're constantly pushing up the stock market by lowering interest rates and so on, then eventually there's inflation, and then people get angry, and then they'll fight against the system. But of course, what they come up with and replace it with will be worse. So, nobody gains from that. You don't want to have like a widespread reaction that's ungovernable. So basically, what's going on in the American economy is that Jerome Powell said, look, we have to stabilize prices, otherwise America is going to become like Argentina. And so he started raising interest rates, and this in turn caused the bond market to fall. But the stock market went down last year, and now it's coming back. And it's really unclear that what Powell has done is enough to stop inflation. But there are huge, huge pressures on him coming from Wall Street and also from the federal government to reduce interest rates. All right. So all of these books, which are about how power operates in a free society, in a democracy, I don't know about a free society, but in a democracy in any case, all predict that up to certain limits, the public interest will not be served by democracy. That what will happen is that special interests will crystallize. These interests can extract rents, and the public is unable to conceptualize a response. And even if they were, they'd be unable to form coalitions that would constitute an effective response. So that's part of why republicanism is so difficult to maintain, and why it exists almost nowhere in the world, because you're basically looking, it's what's called a prisoner's dilemma, that in order to have a democracy, or to have a republic, I don't know if democracy is that important, but the Republican part, the limited government part, in order to have a republic, everyone has to agree not to be too greedy and to behave ethically. And the minute people stop doing that, then it becomes a bottomless pit, and it becomes chaos, and a strong person has to take over. And so that's like a natural process, and that's why there are relatively few republics in the world. Virtually all the countries, especially outside the very rich countries, are not republics. They're dictatorships of various kinds. So basically, power, this thing that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, is true not just in corporate America, but it's true in society at large, and it's always going to be difficult to balance. In other words, you need a strong leader to get things done, but strong leaders are disastrous for long-term public welfare. And so you need a balance. And there needs to be restrictions on what the leaders can do. And unfortunately, what happens is that the change that capitalism creates causes a great deal of uncertainty. It causes the highest standard of living of any economic system. Nothing comes close, but it causes a lot of uncertainty. The uncertainty causes anxiety. The anxiety causes things like narcissism and a thirst for regulation and authoritarianism. And it's from these impulses that people start to choose dictators of various kinds. And so democracy tends to morph into totalitarianism. All right, so basically, I'm going to take attendance, and if you're here, please let me know. Give me let me take this chalkboard off. Please let me know. Now, next week, I said that we're going to, oh, no, in this class, it's always online. I said, I'm going to have everything online next week, but you're not affected. But basically, your discussion board is due next week. I changed the night. I had originally said tonight, but I got all mixed up on the syllabus. And so let's just do it next week when we do conflict and negotiation. Okay, so let me start with attendance. When I call your name, you're free to go, and have a good evening. I'll see you next week. Afzal, Nabia, Omar, Chastity, Aquino, Nita Aslam.
Here.
Hello. Natalie Ben Yosef. Oh, I did the wrong. Natalie.
Here.
Okay. Ariana Besesser.
Here.
Hello, Ariana. Alicia.
Here, thank you.
Thank you. Good night. Anthony.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello. Jerica Cepeda. Alea Charlton.
Here, Professor.
Hello. Soraya Chattery.
Hi, Professor. I'm here.
Oh, hi, Soraya. Glory Christian. Crystal Clark.
Hey, Professor.
Hello, have a good night. Elizabeth Desai.
I'm here.
Hello. Chinyan Ding.
I'm here.
Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you. Vladimir Duval Saint.
I'm here.
Have a good night. Ben Vante Fogler. Okay. Jordan Glenn Williams. Dipu Hossein. Zinin Huang.
Here, Professor.
Have a good evening. Tanya Ingram. Prince Andy Isaac. Yi Lin. Yi.
I'm here, Professor.
Okay, thank you. Karen Liu.
I'm the professor.
Have a good evening. Emin Malik.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello. Joshua Mamie. Josh. Patrice McIntyre.
I'm here.
Hello. Alexandra Melendez. Alexandra. Afranoman,
Here.
hello.
Hi.
Deanna Pierre Lewis, I'm sorry.
It's fine. I'm here.
Thank you. Miftal Proga,
Hello, I'm here. Thank you. Have a good night.
Guoming Kwan,
Professor, I'm here. Have a good night.
thank you, Guoming, have a good evening. Asif Rahman. Rafika Rahman,
I'm here, Professor.
have a
Have a
good
good.
evening, Rafika. Safayat Rahman. Charles Ruan,
I'm here.
hello again. Robert Rubino. Mohammed Sarwar,
I'm here. Hello?
did I hear Mohammed?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Have a good evening.
Good evening.
Lauren Segal,
Here.
have a good night.
You too.
Thank you. Margarita Sherback,
I'm here, Professor.
thanks, Margarita.
Have a good night.
Hafsa Siddiqui,
I'm here.
have a good night. Giovanni Simon,
Here.
have a good night, Giovanni. Chanel Sterling. Chanel. Janiton Surawat.
Hello.
Janiton,
Jonathan is here, but I think Chanel Sterling was talking before.
oh, Chanel is here?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Chanel, okay, I got you both.
Hi, Professor. Chastity's also here. Sorry, my phone was frozen.
Okay, Chastity, I'll mark you.
Did you get Jonathan?
Thank you, Professor.
Yes, I got you, Janiton.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Let me get Chastity. Okay, have a good night. Sanzita, Tanya. Sanzita. Israel. Telpa.
I'm here, Professor. Good night.
Israel. Makeda Tony,
Here, Professor.
have a good night. Abigail Tuachi,
Here.
have a good evening.
Me too.
Thank you. Ghazi Udin,
I'm here, Professor.
have a good night, Ghazi. Ashley Vasquez,
I'm here.
thank you, Ashley, have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Yoland,
I'm present, Professor.
how you doing? Good?
Oh, pretty good, thanks. I have a question, please, when you finish with everything.
Okay, yeah, what's the question? Is it quick?
Yeah, it's gonna be quick when you finish with
Yeah, okay, I just have three more
yes.
names. Joyce.
Here,
Woozy,
Professor.
thanks, Joyce, have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Haorong John,
Yes, I'm here, Professor.
thanks, Haorong.
Yes, good night.
Xiaohua Yan,
I am here, Professor.
thank you, have a good night. And Nagoraktan Akhmedova. Okay, so what's up, Yoland?
It's about finals. I have a difficult time memorizing the whole book. Do you have any pointers?
Don't try to memorize, just try to understand.
Okay.
Read it through carefully, read it a second time. Don't kill yourself with memorization, just try to learn the material.
Okay, thanks. I'll try.
Good.
It's just
Just
not
great.
sticking. It's not sticking at all.
Don't stick, you don't feel it, but you know,
You're right.
break through.
I am not feeling it.
You will. Keep at it.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
All right. Have a good night.
You too, Yolanda. Be well.
Thanks.
Anyone else have a question?
Professor, what day is the final?
The
I didn't see
final?
that on it.
It's the 17th of December.
Yeah, okay, and is it on Blackboard?
It's gonna be on Blackboard.
Okay, thank you so much.
Have a good one.
Hello, Professor.
Yes.
I had a question. So I am looking at my grades right now. So I noticed I did not get points for an activity last month or so. I just wanted to ask if you like put in the points yet.
What was this for?
So, sorry, go on.
What exercise?
So it's October 15th, participation grade. There was no points added. So there were no points added there. So I don't know what's going on.
So you were in class and they didn't give you points?
Yes, I was in class, but there were no points put in there.
Okay, I'll correct that.
Sure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Have a
Bye.
great night.
You too. Niftal, did you have a question?
No, I was just here in case you were gonna go over the people who are missing in the attendance, and just in case I didn't answer when my name was called.
Oh, I have you present.
I know. I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Nothing to worry about. Okay, have a good night. Take care.